Today, we return to the folklore of the past with two more stories from the book Tragedy at Devil's Hollow and Other Kentucky Ghost Stories. Sit back and enjoy these tales from our past as we explore what goes bump in the night. From ghost stories to unexplained phenomena, we will explore the dark and forgotten corners of Kentucky, searching for answers and to see just what might lie beyond our understanding of reality. Thank you for joining me. Now, on to the stories. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Our first story is a classic ghost story. I've heard stories like this told pretty often. I feel like it's a pretty common spin. And then later, after we read the first story coming up, I'll also have a second one to make the episode a little bit longer. Again, thanks everybody for tuning in to listen to me ramble on about folklore a little bit. Anyway, we're going to dive right into it. Our first story is The Ghost Bride. In July 1938, Martin Harmon received a telephone call at his wholesale grocery company's office in Whitesburg, Kentucky, asking him to come to Harlan, Kentucky. A coal company had opened a new commissary and wanted a complete line of groceries and tools delivered, but needed a salesman to make a list before they could place such a large order. It was late in the day when Harmon left Whitesburg, but because the mountain roads were in poor condition and because a storm seemed imminent, he decided to leave on his trip at once. It was beginning to get dark when he reached the other side of Pine Mountain, and he found himself in a regular cloudburst. The rumbling thunder seemed to shake the mountain, and flashes of lightning created an eerie world out of the darkness. High winds hurled tree limbs and other debris into the road, slowing Harmon's progress. There was not a place within miles where he could hope to get a night's lodging. He had to keep going. He had turned a sharp curve in the winding road when he almost lost control of his car. There, beside the road, was a young woman, waving for him to stop. He could see by his headlights that she was dressed in a wedding gown. Harmon pulled to a stop, and the girl approached the car. Her dark hair was rain-soaked, and her face had a gray pallor. She seemed to be in a state of shock. In an almost hysterical voice, she told him that the bridge he would have had to cross at Poor Fork on the Cumberland River had washed away in the storm, that she and her best friend had driven into the stream and her friend had drowned. She then told him that he should not drive down into the valley, but should instead take another road a few hundred yards ahead. Harmon asked the girl if he could help her, or the girl who had drowned. She replied that her name was Colleen Tyler, and that she lived on the road that she knew to be safe, and she would have a ride for that far. When the young woman sat down beside him, Harmon noticed that she was developing a chill. He placed his coat around her shoulders, but she seemed not to notice. Her head was turned and she kept looking out the window into the storm, as if searching for something or someone. Asking for directions, Harmon was told to turn into a gravel road. Though it continued to rain, and occasional flashes of lightning could still be seen, and the rumble of the thunder came from the mountain, the worst of the storm was over. Harmon was curious about the girl, wondering why she was dressed in a bridal gown and what she had been doing on this lonely mountain road at night in such a storm. He didn't question her. She still seemed to be in shock and continued to stare vacantly out the car's window. After about half an hour, they arrived at Colleen's home. The rain had stopped. She thanked him as Harmon watched her in his car's headlights. She walked around to the house to what he assumed was the back door. Harmon drove on towards Harlan before he remembered that Colleen still had his coat around her shoulders. But he was now in a hurry to continue his trip and decided to stop by on his return. The small frame house would be easy to find because it only had a white board fence. that he had seen along the gravel road. The next morning in Harmon learned that the bridge Colleen had told him about had indeed washed away during the storm of the previous night. 2 men had drowned when their car ran into the stream. They had failed to see that the bridge was gone. But no one else was reported drowned. Harmon was now more than ever determined to stop and thank Colleen for her warning, which had almost certainly saved his life. After finishing his business, Harmon started on his return trip to Whitesburg, following the route Colleen had shown him. He arrived at her house within a few hours. An elderly, white-haired lady answered his knock and stared at him in disbelief as Harmon introduced himself and told her briefly of his experience the night before. "I'm Colleen's mother," the woman said, "and you have to be mistaken. It couldn't have been my daughter because she drowned 4 years ago in just such a storm as we had last night. You must have seen someone else." She explained that Colleen and a friend had been on their way to a church in the valley where Colleen was to be married. The rest of the family had already gone to the church and were waiting when the storm started. Not knowing the bridge had been washed away, the two young ladies drove their car into the river and were both drowned. Colleen's body had been recovered and was buried in the family cemetery a short distance around the back of the house. It was Harmon's turn to stare. Mrs. Tyler said, "I'll show you her grave." Harmon remembered as they walked across the yard and around the house that Colleen had been walking this way when he last saw her. As they neared the cemetery, Mrs. Tyler continued, Since it was to have been her wedding day, we decided to bury Colleen in her wedding gown. We thought she would have liked that." When they came to Colleen's grave, they were both amazed and stood speechless, for there, draped over the headstone, was Harmon's coat and a still damp bridal veil. Author's note: I can learn of no sightings of this phantom within the last 30-odd years, but the ghost of the bride-to-be was seen on several occasions during the 1930s and the 1940s, either near where the old bridge crossed the Poor Fork of the Cumberland River, or along the road that used to pass close by this stream. The apparition was always seen during or just before a heavy rainstorm. All right, a classic ghost story that I've personally heard this one retold in different settings, time periods, areas throughout the country. Um, this one is it's pretty good. There is one thing, just story wise, if you will. It's probably not fair to pick on basically a campfire story, but like the dead friend is never brought up again after she tells him, after he asks if the dead friend needs help. That's just dropped. Yeah, uh, that took me out of it just a little bit, but I mean, I'm trying not to judge too harshly here. It's a good story for what it is. It's a classic, but yeah. Other than that, just a good old fashioned ghost story, like they used to tell, for years and years. Um, but yeah, the next one we're going to get into, however, is not a ghost story. This one is under the subtitle or chapter title of Unexplained Phenomenon. And this one is one of my favorites from the book. I really enjoy the subject matter here. I think it's very different than a lot of folk stories that I read. So, excited to get into that. We'll be starting here in a second. The Vanishing Bird Family. About 1900, a family considered to be very strange by their few, isolated neighbors lived on a high point above the North Fork of the Kentucky River. There were 9 members in this family, and they lived in a large log house built in an unusual oblong fashion. They made no friends and allowed no one except the family to enter their home. On occasion, people passing along the road in front of this dwelling could hear screams and a flapping sound such as a large winged bird might make. There were also sounds of high-pitched voices, and the sound of blows, such as might be made by as if a person were being beaten. At night, passerby in Williams Creek might hear a splash, as if a large object were being dropped into the water. The sound was always heard near this house. No one ever saw any lights or smoke coming from this house. The chimneys apparently never had a fire in them. Eventually, the sounds from the house became the talk of the few families living upstream. Years passed, and a graveyard appeared on the hill behind the home, although no neighbors had ever heard of a death or a burial in this family. Several years after it was first noticed, the graveyard had grown to contain over 50 small tombstones, made of plain creek rock. Strangely, it appeared there were still 9 members in this family. They were seen separately at various times in the local village some 2 miles away, where they purchased only the bare necessities, but they always bought some type of grain. Not only did they appear to be the same individuals, but they never seemed to grow any older. They were physically small, and the few people who ever saw them up close swore their faces resembled that of a bird, with a long nose and a receding chin. They all walked with a quick, jerky kind of step, spoke in a high-pitched voice, and always wore gloves and a long coat. After about 10 years, curiosity got the best of a group of men, and they made plans to check on the actions of this strange family. They wanted some explanations. How did they live? They did very little farming, and they owned no farm animals. Why did they seem never to age? Why did a cemetery continue to grow when there were no known deaths in this family? Before going to talk to the odd family, though, the men checked in on the travelers who were known to have used the road going by their home frequently. They found no reports of missing persons, violence, or death. On a clear, moonlit night, about 50 men assembled to visit the unusual family. They formed 2 groups so they could approach the house from different directions. One group reached the front yard as the other came into the backyard, and they were all amazed to see 9 large birds fly away from the rooftop of the house. They entered the large dwelling to find nothing but piles of straw, resembling huge birds' nests. No furniture, clothes, tools, or any other human necessities were found. The next morning, the men investigated the graveyard. They opened some 20 of the graves and found small human skeletons. The skeletons revealed an amazing trait never before seen by any of those present. Each of the skeletons had 2 large extra bones along the shoulder. This seemed to indicate that, while the bodies appeared human, they had somehow developed the ability to fly. The bones were hollow, like those of birds, and some of the first bodies to be buried had completely disintegrated. Before leaving, the men burned the house, and the area was avoided thereafter. What kind of creatures were these? Where had they come from, and where did they go? The number of graves would indicate an impossible birth rate for a normal human family. Might the sounds of objects being dropped into the creek have been eggs that would not hatch? A bird will throw these out of their nest, especially ones without a shell. All traces of the house's foundation, the cemetery, and the bridge are gone now, and only slight indentations above the river show where the old road used to be. Today, on the high point of land where the dwelling stood, some unusual blackbirds are occasionally seen. They are exceptionally large and seem reluctant to fly away. They watch and follow people who come near. At times, it seems, they may be trying to speak. Author's note: my grandmother, born in 1877, heard this story firsthand from neighbors, who were among the men who exhumed the bodies of the bird people and helped burn the house. She and other elderly persons told me the story when I was about 15 years old. Okay, I absolutely love that last story. Bird people, I just, that is so different than a lot of the stories you're going to get. I couldn't even begin to imagine where this one would have came from. This is it's not so much spooky or even unsettling, but it's so interesting. Um, it's one of my favorites. I think it's written pretty well compared to a lot of the other work the author has done. His stories, and it really gets my imagination going. Like, I mean, he lays out a lot of it. He doesn't leave a lot to mystery, but like, still, they aliens. I mean, that in this book was written in the '70s, and aliens were very popular. But this could have also been some like offshoot of humanity, or or I guess an offshoot of birds. I don't. It's just it's one of my favorites. I love it. It's one that stuck with me, and it also dabbles a little bit in my interest in cryptids and whatnot. But yeah, that's a really good one. I hope you enjoyed that. I one last note: you gotta love that the 50 dudes show up, see something strange, and their first solution is burn everything down. I mean, it's just a classic 1900s. Am I right? But yeah, that's going to be it for me tonight. I hope you've enjoyed these two stories. Uh, if you have lasted this long, thank you for listening and watching. This is Hopeful American signing out.